starting with the article, what I'd like to do is just a format. To start with that article by Trevor Loudon. Do all of you remember receiving that? Of course, there's so many new people here who didn't get the distribution. What I'm going to do, and I apologize for doing it this way, but I can see no other way to do it, is just assume a certain understanding of it, and I'll read some of the provisions of this article, and so we'll talk about them in that way. He does us the advantage of enumerating his points, and there are 9 in total. What we'll do is talk about each one, and as we talk about it, I encourage you to raise questions or make comments and apply that discussion, that one issue, to the general topic of socialism. Loudon says we need to face reality. That we have been and remain in complete denial about how this country has so rapidly been taken over by the communist Marxist socialism emanating in part from China. Trump isn't coming back soon, not until at least 2004. We can do something about this disaster that has afflicted us. Some elements of that disaster. Democrats who now have control and the ability to put anything they want through Congress. Now, I hope you gather that some of what I'm saying protrudes from my cheek, called tongue. The Democratic ability to do things today is extremely limited. A 50-50 Senate with a vote, the deciding vote by the Vice President, means that most actions to avoid the filibuster have to either be done by budget resolution, which doesn't extend to very many things, certainly anything outside the budget, or we have to go to that so-called nuclear option of doing away with or significantly modifying the filibuster. And every time that topic comes up, at least 2, sometimes 4 or 5 Democratic senators say, not on my watch, which means it's not going to happen. Or the president says, I'm still a firm believer in the filibuster and its value to our way of making decisions. So the idea that Democrats are going to do anything major outside of the $7 or $8 trillion they might spend can't be major. And that only because of budget resolution. The idea that anything else is not likely. In the House itself, Nancy Pelosi has a thin majority, and they're not, radical ideologues. Several of the congressmen are desperate to hang on to their seats, and with elections coming up in only 2 years, only a year and a half now, they're not about to do anything that will put their seats in jeopardy. So even the idea that the House will just run roughshod over our system. What's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to enfranchise 22 million illegal immigrants. 22 million. What's the number of illegal immigrants that most of you understand to be the... 11. Roughly half that.
We don't really know.
But we don't really know. And a lot of these people have illegal concubines. I'm almost certain of it. Tongue in cheek. They're going to abolish the Electoral College. Democrats are going to do that with a slim to none majority in the Senate on that issue and all manner of mechanisms. What I'm saying is that Loudon's fear is a fear-based article. This article is a fear-based article that exaggerates the extent and the imminence of the danger. They will gain at least 4 far-left senators through Puerto Rico and D.C. statehood. Yeah, statehood could happen. It could happen if all 50 Democratic senators voted yes. The vice president resolved the tie by voting with them to bring in 4 new senators.
You want the microphone or?
Yeah, we need to do that. Sal, can you bring the microphone? Oh, here we are, behind you. Thank you.
I haven't seen it noted, but when the Republic of Texas joined the United States,
Turn it on.
Not on.
is not on, is it no?
Is it on now? Is it not?
No,
Is it on?
No.
If you're trying to sell telephones, we can't hear you now.
And now is it on?
Yes.
Okay. When the Republic of Texas joined the United States earlier in the 19th century, one of the provisions was that at some point in the future, they could change the state of Texas to 5 states, which would add 8 additional senators. Now, I've never seen any note of that in the press or anything, but that was one of the provisions when Texas joined the United States.
Interesting. I wonder if that provision, was that something where the other states agreed to that in order to allow Texas to come in? Because as I understood it, the idea of adding a state took a whole series of things had to happen, all of which have happened in the case of D.C., except for final approval in the Senate. The House passed the resolution, they've got their constitution, they've done all the steps preceding to becoming a state. Puerto Rico is very early in that process, has many steps to take. But the idea, we talked about this once before, when Hawaii and Alaska came in, they came in together because it was 2 Democratic votes, Hawaii, against 2 Republican votes, Alaska. I think the idea of nonsensical change is something we need to resist. There will not be 2 states brought into the United States simply to gain a Democratic advantage in the Senate. It's a nice thing to be afraid of, but I don't think anybody realistically expects it to happen. That's my whole point. And flood the country with tens of millions more third world refugees and illegal immigrants. That's on top of the 22 million that are already here. We talked about immigration and refugees coming to the United States before, and I think it's a topic we might need to revisit. The distinction between refugees and other forms of immigrants, other types of immigrants. Does anybody remember what we talked about in that category? Refugees are determined by the State Department and international treaties. They have to go through a lengthy process of application and vetting. Almost all refugees have lived in or now live in refugee settlements somewhere and have gone through that process while living in those settlements. This country was a leader among nations in accepting refugees. And refugees are deemed refugees because they are fleeing violence of some kind or discrimination. In the past, we've accepted, wasn't it 100,000 was our limit on annual refugees? And we brought that down to 16,000, I think, at the end of the last, the Trump administration. That's not flooding the country with millions of refugees that are dangerous. As far as illegal immigrants that are not counted in the 22 million, which is probably closer to 11 million, that's an issue that just demands resolution. And I'm not saying that because of my fear of illegal immigrants. I'm saying it in part because I think what's going on in the border is just awful in terms of children. Those temporary facilities where the unaccompanied minors are placed just can't be right. And we need to do something about that. I don't think that something about that is simply close the door. Nor is it, though, to drop them down. I don't know how many of you saw that news, dropping them down the 14-foot wall. Which meant that they had to find on a 2,000-mile or 2,500-mile border, the 400 miles where the wall exists, climb up that wall on one side and drop it down on the other. If I were a coyote, I think I'd have walked down where there wasn't a wall. But then again. Also plan to introduce voting reforms, which is mass mail-in abolition of ID requirements and guarantee, thus, Democratic Party control. My point to this is in this face reality. It seems to me that the reality is a series of boogeymen. that we're meant to be afraid of when in fact most of them are not even there. Do you have any comments on that point? Forrest?
Lots of comments.
Aha. Good.
We're, 17 minutes in, and I haven't heard any other point of view except Doug's.
And that's an unfair advantage I have.
I know it is, and you prepare well, and I'm proud of you, and I like you. I really do, and you know it. But, Bob, I think that your characterization of all these things as fear is based on some reality, too. In a lot of reality, we have the government involved in our lives to the degree we really don't enjoy. If most people look at the math of Social Security, and we all get checks regularly from them, but if you look at the rate of return on that money, it's been pathetic. And there was never a trust fund. They've been robbing from that trust fund forever. It's a budget item, the way they use it. And the idea that we can't privatize any of it is just absurd, because they basically have stolen from us, and they give it back at piecemeal out of current income. So I feel like that I fear government. I love Vicki Oates because she's close to her populace, and she's responsive to us, and did a marvelous job last time, because she's close to us and we vote for her. The separation from people to their representatives today is absurd. The average congressperson represents 700,000 people. The average senator represents 7 million. So we don't have any real touch with the federal government. I don't think they have any right to tell me what I should do with my money. That they're going to go do something I don't agree with. So I have a fear of government. Absolutely.
There's a lot packed into that
Yes.
for us, and I respect it. The opposition to Social Security and some of the elements of Social Security, among other things, that as we are today, we're going to run out of money in the Social Security Trust Fund. You know, the projection is always moving somewhere in the future, but it's going to run out of money unless we do something. And the ideas about what to do are numerous. I don't know that today is the day to debate modifications to Social Security or even abolishing it. But I'm curious about...
I'm suggesting run it honestly.
Run it honestly. And I assume to some extent privatize it.
I would love to privatize it.
Okay. Can we, first of all, by show of hands, how many people here are familiar with the arguments for privatization of Social Security? Not all at once. So, and how many more or less favor that concept? 3. I read about opting out, the process of opting out of Social Security, and it's not very easy, is it?
Congress does it for themselves.
Well, then you have to be
They're not
elected.
covered.
They're not covered by Social Security?
They're not.
Because they have a better program as Congress.
Absolutely. They're looking out for themselves.
Can we say, is Social Security something we should make as a topic for the group sometime? Or anybody in favor of that?
It's part of your concern about fear. A lot of my fear is fact-based.
No, what I'm saying is when I read these paragraphs about doubling the number of illegal immigrants, that generates more fear than half the number would. That's what I'm saying. The Democrats want to...
Either one's a big number, is my,
I'm sorry?
either one is a big number.
They're-
11 or 22, either one.
They're both big numbers. And you're not more afraid of 22 than you are of 11. That's fair.
I've got a comment on Social Security.
Totally privatization of Social Security, unfortunately, will not work. Social Security is an income redistribution program from the wealthy to the poor. More specifically, probably for those of us in this room here, if we earn it to replace 15% of our income above a certain level, below where we're getting benefits today. For somebody at the lower end of the income scale, Social Security replaces 90% of their income. So if we have that magnitude of income redistribution, partial privatization but not a major privatization because of the income transfer provisions from the wealthy to the lower income deciles that's already incorporated into present formulas.
Everybody understand that? That deals with our second topic, which is income inequality. Redistribution of wealth is a major part of Social Security. It's not just a mandatory retirement savings program. As Doug pointed out, for those of you, roughly 15% of our incomes, generally, on average, are derived from Social Security, if that even, 15% or below. For the very poor in this country, that number is 90%, and in some cases it's very close to the only income they have. Were it not for that redistributive impact of Social Security, our problem is going to be much worse. As I understand the privatization issue, it's not the idea of privatizing it to eliminate that redistribution thing. It's to make it more efficient as a redistributive effort. Is that right, Forrest?
You could argue that. I'm not concerned about the 90% of the people where they might be is their only income. I'm not at all concerned about that. I would like to see it out of the government realm or have some joint commission to run it. And it's not the way it was designed and offered to the public in the 30s. It's a far cry from that. But the fact that they haven't kept the funds separate is essentially a fraudulent operation for the original offering.
And I'm not going to disagree with that. You know, the idea that it's no longer a separate fund went out the window when it had more money than it needed to distribute, and we wanted to grab that money and use it for other purposes. Now that it has more distributions than it has income, that debate rages.
Bob, there's another question about Social Security that I think if any politician ever used it, he would get an awful lot of minority votes. The black people in this country live much shorter lives than white people generally. Do you think they should get a higher income than white people? Actually, they should.
I'm not understanding completely the point.
If you have an income that's supposedly for a person's life, if it's likely to be an extended life versus a shorter life, you could give more income to the people with an expected shorter life.
You should give more of the income to people with shorter lives,
Absolutely.
but don't those with longer lives need the income longer?
They will, but they get less income. If you use the principal and income in the distribution, you would have to give lower income to the longer livers.
Color me dense, but I'm not working through that as well as I should.
That's all
Thank you. We're going to talk about Social Security in depth at another time, all right? Because I think particularly the ideas of privatizing the income side of it, solving the fund running out of money. But I want to go back to this first point of, I'm sorry, Neil?
We're throwing the term privatization around
Wait a minute.
without having any idea of
Hang
what.
on, Neil, wait, you gotta start all over again. We lose.
I just said we're throwing the privatization of Social Security without having any idea what that means. I'm not sure I can think of a single major project the government has privatized and has come out better than it was before, but there's probably something out there. And secondly, Social Security is based upon the income that you've made in some previous number of years. So the more income you have, the more payment you get from Social Security. If that's a disequality, then it is, but that's what it's based on, and that's my experience.
It limits the redistributive effect of Social Security. Let's come back to the whole discussion of Social Security at a different time, but I agree with you. And I think we'll talk about privatizing public things in the limited time we devote to the socialism discussion. Because privatizing roads, privatizing prisons, privatizing other things hasn't had the results that originally intended. The last sentence from that first point, we're undergoing a Marxist-Leninist revolution driven by China, right now in real time. If that's not a fear-mongering statement, I don't know what is, because I'm not sure what China has to do with our Medicare or our Social Security, or how they're trying to socialize America. They're trying to make goods cheaper and take, to the extent they make goods less expensively than we do, they capture our market. But is that some devious political plot? I'm not sure. But I pointed out because that's the first point of this thing. Secondly, we need to stop all violent rhetoric. And his point here is we should prevent people who have grievances, and he specifically mentions Black Lives Matter, from using violent rhetoric and advocating for their position. First of all, I'm not sure how you do that in a First Amendment society. So the mechanism alone gives me trouble. But secondly, I think it's kind of cool that in this country we're not punished for our statements, but rather for our acts. I don't know how all of you feel about that. Comments welcome.
It's less true today than it used to be. I said it's less true today than it used to be,
That we're,
because the media was not so concentrated on one side of that aisle.
I watched Hannity last night, and and I'm going to say that he was on a different side of the aisle than I'm normally.
I'm sure that's
Restore election integrity. I'm sorry,
I have to laugh at the concept of Black Lives Matter is worse than January 6th assault on our government, with radical organizations creating mayhem, injuring people, and so on. It's kind of a joke, except it's a bad joke.
Yeah. Jim? Did you want to say something? Martha?
No, I agree, totally.
Thank you.
Violently.
Pardon me?
I said violently agree.
Oh, I didn't
Restore.
say that.
I know you didn't say that. I could go on. The idea of restoring integrity of red states, again, part of the Loudon article. How many here believe today that the election last year was stolen? Hands up.
I don't think it was stolen, but I think there were a lot of states moved their laws in the midst of it. I don't think it was stolen. I think that they legitimately won the election in total electoral count. But I do think that states set aside their legislative actions and changed them during the election process.
Were they doing that to win elections or because of COVID?
They blamed it on COVID, but they were happy to do it.
Most of the ones who did that, though, were Republican, weren't they?
Some 50 or 60 legal actions against the stealing of the election were rejected 100%. So anyone can say, gee, it was maybe stolen. I have to feel sorry for that person.
I hear you, and I understand it, and I agree with you, Neil, but it's simple. The Supreme Court said it would not change the result, even if they went in favor of the action asked for. But that, to me, denies the opportunity to reform responsibly where they, that was required under the various state legislatures. And there was no public interaction in that. It just was done without any legislative involvement. So I think the Supreme Court missed a real opportunity there. They could have said, okay, if this case alone, regardless of the impact or lack of it on the election, they should have taken a stand for the operating under the law, and they didn't.
It's your court.
Not exactly.
Actually,
There's a lot of guys coming out of the district court of D.C., regardless of their party.
No, but I thought you were talking about the Supreme Court.
I know you are, but a lot of people that come out of the district court in DC end up on the court, and regardless of their political registration, they don't necessarily vote their party, including Earl Warren, when he was the governor of California's a Republican. He was voted Republican in action, and they're plenty since then.
Okay? I'm not going to buy that, by the way. I think the 6-3 conservative majority on the court is pretty real. At least a definite 5-4. And if you say Roberts could go either way. And if that majority didn't say, this is a law, a change by Pennsylvania, let's say, which I think was the case that came before the court.
Pennsylvania was the case I referred to.
Yeah. If they didn't say the irregularity associated with those election changes is such that we need to intervene, I can't imagine that being a political event. But that's another thing to talk about. The reason to address this, though, Vicki Oakes was here last week, and she said there are 2 dangers to the Florida voting system, of which she's very proud, by the way, and I think justifiably. Everything I've read about it, it's a very good system. One of the dangers is H.R. 1, the so-called For the People Act that the federal government is working through. But the other, she said, and the one which 67 election supervisors in Florida have all opposed, is coming right out of Tallahassee. And that is a cookie cutter set of election reforms that follow what's happening in Georgia, but that's in 33 states today. She was adamant about the fact that that would not improve voting in Florida. It would make it worse, make it less efficient, less effective. And you heard her, yeah. So I think that the idea here is that the only reason that in order to roll back this Marxist-Leninist change in our country is to reform the election laws, which were so weak that they allowed Biden to win. And that clearly is the intention of this article. My whole point is, again, it's fear. And it's not necessarily based in fact, as I see it. We ought to expand this besides just Forrest and me.
Yep, we have.
Carolee?
Can you drop your mask?
Well, let me take my mask off. That article infuriated me so much that I went to the dictionary to find out that because people keep relating socialism and fading it into communism. And the main difference is that socialism is compatible with democracy and liberty, whereas communism involves creating an equal society through an authoritarian state which denies basic liberties. Democratic socialism in the West involves participating in democracy to seek an incremental reduction to inequality, which brings us to our next step. And that's exactly what's happening. That, again, I repeat this, democratic socialism in the West involves participating in democracy to seek an incremental reduction in inequality.
Neil? Before Neil, you've talked once before. Bob?
Could someone explain the difference between progressivism and socialism? Could someone define the difference between socialism and progressivism? Is that just a name change, or is that a difference in philosophy in terms of government?
Anybody want to offer an answer to that?
I didn't hear the question.
Jacques? Long-time American citizen, Jacques.
I don't think that what the difference is that they're not the same. And progressivism is can be applied to a conservative party, could be applied to any kind of party, as long as it is progressive, which means going forward. And you have some socialist party, for example, which can be really conservative. And that looks a little bit curious, but I mean, unions, for example, have been working differently in progressive ways and also in very conservative ways. In the past, for example, you had the unions who took advantage of their fight against their business in order to get some rights, and that was advancing the society in the sense that they were allowed to get a little bit more at ease financially and become a kind of a middle class. That's the origin of the middle class, very curiously, but the middle class, for a great part, has been established because of the fight of the unions. Now, the unions in many countries had become conservative to the point that workers themselves have given up on union duties, and they're not conservative. So there used to be a relation between conservatism and progressivism, but it's not necessarily conservative. There are politicians who use the word conservative, and there's not. Sometimes they use it to give an end to their party, but really, fundamentally, it's not the same thing, and it should not be applied to any system of party. It could be applied only on some parties if they show that they are conservative.
I think trying to go back just a second, so I think there are two different concepts really. Progressive would be opposite to regressive, I would think. Socialism, perhaps contra capitalism, if you wanted to find an opposite, although I don't even accept that completely. Would you call, another way to ask that question, is there a difference between Democrats and socialism? I think that's a fair question.
I don't know, but I'm confused over the fact that the Democratic Party seems to be divided in terms of the charter that Democrats are based on versus the progressive segment that is being governed or being promoted by certain individuals within the Democratic Party. And our president says he is going to be the most progressive president ever elected. So what's his charter? Is it based on the Democratic Party or based on something called progressive? I don't know. I'd like to have someone give me something that says, here are the planks, if you will, that the Republican Party is based on, that the Democratic Party is based on, and if there's a thing called the Progressive Party, then what is the platform? Or is the Democratic Party moving towards a different platform than they currently have? I don't know.
The terms can get confusing. I can, in my own mind's eye, I can see a very progressive yet conservative approach to government. I think infrastructure, for example, the most modern broadband system and rail system and bridge system in the world must be progressive. But I can see a conservative country, a conservative political group advocating for that progressive. Does that make any sense, that distinction? Likewise, I would think that a progressive position versus racial, in respect of racial equality, would advocate for a whole series of actions that could be a Republican Party progressive or a Democratic Party progressive. I think it's different from socialism. Socialism, going back to what Carol Lee said and what we've read before, is really a form of economic management. Whereas I think progressivism deals with a whole host of issues. Does that make any sense?
As long as they don't move to it's my understanding that there's an attempt to only have two political parties in the country and not allow a third party.
I think it's allowed, it just isn't effective.
Well, but there's a lot of laws that can be changed to support that.
No, it's true.
I think the true definition of socialism involves the ownership of the means of production by the government. We're now nowhere near that, nor will we ever be. Yes, we have some socialistic policies. Social Security is one, Veterans Administration is another one, but it is not socialism. I think progressive policies are dealing with the betterment of the environment, the economy, the whole structure of the country. I don't think that's socialism.
Or stated, you could be a progressive and want to improve the country and be an ardent capitalist opposed to any form of government ownership of the means of production. To me, I'm going to go back to this, the means of production, socialism, and capitalism thing. I think it's really important to focus on the distinction between public and private goods, or public and private functions. There are things that should never be, in my view, nationalized or owned by the government. I talked the other day about working in Eastern Europe for 3.5 years, where my example I used were two companies, one in Lithuania and the other in Romania, that made car doors and did so very efficiently. They were incredibly good doors that were meticulously well made. The problem is they were made for cars that had been taken out of circulation 20 years earlier. And that's the government managing production in a way they shouldn't have. Far better than that be a private function. On the other hand, I also worked on private roads and private bridges. My business was private electricity. And boy, the extent to which you blur the line between what's a public need or function and what's a private one. Where do we allow profit to be made and the provision of it? Should water be private, for example, which Enron tried to do and other countries have tried to do? That's a tough thing to do. I'm going to charge you money for water. Ron, or Ken, I'm sorry.
Well, if we put a face on the subject of socialism, it's Bernie Sanders. He's been a socialist, admittedly, all his life in the Congress. And in 2022, just the 2020 election, he came close. You know, he had to make a deal, I guess, to drop out to let Joe Biden proceed. But even in 2016, if it wasn't for the superdelegates that Hillary won, he could, you know, the point is, socialism may be a lot closer to the minds of a lot of people. Bernie Sanders got a lot of support in the last election.
And as true as it is, it's important to focus on that because he's not talking about Marxist, Leninist, China-driven.
But he does have policies that I think Bob's point is that really should be elaborated on. And he did it in the debates, the pretty good debates in the Democratic primaries. And but he does go far afield, and that's right. At some point, the focus on that has to be clear because there's a lot more support for socialism than maybe we know.
One of the things I did in copying articles was to look at the Pew Research Center's numerous efforts to poll the popularity of socialism. It's truly a majority view among independents and Democrats, and it's a much larger minority among Republicans than you think, and especially when you focus on the evidence of socialism in this country, the wealth transfer, wealth redistribution programs, Social Security and Medicare. Public education is another public function. It's not in favor right now among a lot of people, but I think that's another topic I'd like to defer to another time. In fact, I think it's a really important topic to talk about how we fund it, how we organize it, how we manage it, education in general, not just public education. We've only got about 15 minutes left, and I would like to just talk a little bit about Forrest's article on inequality. The main points in that article were that the government, it was written by Phil Gramm and who's the other guy?
Kessler.
And Kessler, Alan Kessler.
Editorial writer for the Journal.
No, Phil Gramm and John Early.
separate article.
written by Andy Kessler, a separate article. The article by Kessler, Inequality by Way of Government, is saying that capitalism was doing a better job at eliminating inequality than our form of government intervention. Is that basically his argument for us? That's an intriguing question. Among the things he talks about, though, he calls the four horsemen of public efforts to do good things that end up making for greater inequality. The first of the four horsemen is public education, public schools. To me, one of the biggest tragedies in our country today, and why I'd like to devote more time to it in another full-time meeting, is that public education is paid for primarily with property taxes. And what that means is rich neighborhoods have better schools. That is an incredibly inequality-producing activity, if you think about it just for a second. Why is it we're all so proud of Ponte Vedra High School and not so proud of the high schools in the poorest parts of town? It doesn't take very much time to figure that out. You can say public schools are controlled by teachers' union, and that's why they're bad. And I'm not a big fan of some of the actions of the unions. On the other hand, I think that the budget disparities between the good and the bad public schools are just enormous. And that does create more inequality. But is it the fault of the government system, or is it because we've allowed the evolution of this form of payment for our public schools? Comments on public education? Doug?
I think with the broad statements you made, I'm going to take them apart a little bit. I have some experience with the Duval County Schools as a guardian ad litem, essentially representing children in foster care. I did have the experience in Duval County of actually pulling students out of the public school system, enrolling them in private schools. I financed this through the Florida the scholarship program that the state of Florida set up. Round numbers is about $6,000 a year per student. But that's enough at some private schools to cover the tuition. Also, my experience in the Duval County schools, and I'm dealing with primarily with the poorer performing schools, that the way the new teachers are assigned in Duval County, you get a new teacher out of school, on fire, energetic, ready to go, and they get sent to the poorer schools. I've had kids that are in first grade, second grade, and regardless of the quality of the school, and this, you go in these school ratings, they're very low rated, but those teachers are on fire, and they're going to teach those kids to read, no matter what the administration of the school is. So, one, I'm going to say that the amount of money going into the school is not correlated with the quality of the education necessarily. And within these poorer schools, there are teachers, multiple teachers, that are on fire, and they're going to do their thing regardless of what the administration of the school is.
Good point. Good point. And I came out of public schools, and I have to believe it must have been a really good system. A second one is occupational licensing, a nice way to say job restriction. I'm sorry, Bud?
Yeah. In Michigan, they have taken the property taxes away from the district they're created in and sent them back to the capital to be redistributed as needed to other parts of the state.
Interesting. How's it working?
Well, it depends on which end of the scale you're on. It gets a lot of money down into Detroit where the schools need it, and away from areas like we have a Sour Place that are really not that difficult to fund anyway.
Interesting. I'd be curious to see in the long run whether that starts to balance the quality of education for the two systems. The idea idea of not licensing many forms of jobs. Do you have a comment? I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Caroline.
Well, first of all, the article demonized the unions, the teachers' unions. I have been a proud member of the teachers' union for many years. I was a public school teacher for 25 years in New York State, but we were paid very well. I think people don't realize that in St. Johns County, the school district is the county. And so the distribution of funds is equal here. We happen to live in an upscale community where the parents raise a great deal of money to enhance the school district. I don't know if people realize how much money the parents raise to put in playgrounds, to put in all kinds of things in this county. But the distribution is equal because the entire school district is run by the county.
But
which is unlike
parent-raised
any
funds
other
go-
place I've ever lived. Excuse me?
Parent-raised funds go equally in the county, or do they go to the school where the parents raise the fund?
I'm sorry, can
When parents raise money for schools, do
Yes.
they allow that to go to schools other than where their children are?
yes, they allow it to be for that school because they're usually raising money for a specific project, like a playground for the school.
I'm not making myself clear. I would have assumed that in a wealthy community, parents would raise more money than they would
Of
in a
course.
poor community.
Of
And
course.
therefore, the wealthy school would have better playground equipment.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's not
But-
distributed throughout
but
the county.
But the initial distribution is the same throughout the county. I don't know if people realize that or not.
I didn't.
That's unusual.
It's an interesting point. Please.
As a former teacher at Farmview Pump Out for 25 years, we counted on our parents, and our parents came through, and that's where our money came from, to be perfectly honest. We had parents that came in and raised unbelievable funds for all of our extras, and that's where our extra came from.
I think that the participation of parents, not just in fun, but that's huge, but also their activity in support of their children and their activities in school and their homework at home. I mean, one of the things we've learned, if nothing else, is that those kids that have the benefits of good parents still marry, not addicted, not in prison. Big advantages. Big advantages. Don.
I think one element you have to keep in mind about the educational system around the country, not Ponte Vedra necessarily, probably not at all, but educational system has become a daycare program for many, many people. And we've seen that illustrated in the problems that have developed with this pandemic. And children can't go to school. So the parents are then caught in the middle of a social and economic problem. But this, the fact that this has evolved over a period of time is getting to the point where, many places in this country, the main meal that children get is what they get at school, not what they get at home. And so this whole element of education is evolving into a bigger program than just reading, writing, and arithmetic.
I'm going to go back to Bob's point about progressivism. Many of the most interesting ideas in education, I think of as progressive ideas, are sadly, and I say this because I fear what happens to the leftover kids in the public schools, but charter schools and the movement toward really innovative techniques for teaching, all I think of as progressive ideas. But they're certainly not in favor of the public education system. The most progressive ideas are sometimes on the private side. We're about out of time. I want to talk a little bit about next week's program. We have hardly touched the surface of socialism and income inequality. They're big topics. And we can break them into pieces and talk about the individual pieces at length. Which we'll have time to do. Not anybody's going to go anywhere soon. Parvez Ahmed. How many people here have heard the name or know him? Cool. Is a professor of economics at UNF. He has recently become chair of the Coghlan School of Diversity and Inclusion. And he will be here next Friday to talk about diversity and democracy. Among the things I warned him about, I said that we're inclined to want to talk about, raise questions about wokeism, cancel culture, how those things relate to the issues of diversity and inclusion today. To talk a little bit about how diversity and the voting issues we've been talking about over the past few weeks relate to each other, and he's going to be prepared for that. The format, I think, basically it's going to be, he'll say a few things and we'll do some Q&A. He and I are talking about kind of an interview approach where I'll ask him some of the questions, but just a hint, I'm not going to ask him anything he didn't tell me to ask him, so it's not controversial. I'm inclined to want to do a survey here, and I want your views on that, to get a better feeling for what both your interests are for future current events meetings, and kind of what our attitudes are coming in. And my thought would be an absolutely anonymous survey form where you'd identify your party persuasion, sex. We're not going to ask for ages because it's an age equality effort. We're assuming many of you are older. Just check older. But then we'll go through things like voter reform, questions like, was the election stolen? What should we do about the border? A series of questions. Does that make some sense to you all? To get a feeling for, and then I'll share the results of that and talk about whether men or women are more concerned about educational improvements or cooking utensil quality. That last part. Any questions? Neil.
You got to stay near Neil.
It's not so much a question, but I am puzzled by this whole aspect of education. And now I then see the demonization of the Asian and the Philippines and so forth. Anybody who has gone to school and had Chinese students nearby with them and so forth quickly learned they were the best prepared, the smartest in the class. Why? Because their parents made them work to get ahead. And so I'm not sure we're missing some things in here when we talk about education. And why are the Chinese being demonized when I think they're being feared by those who are doing it because they know they're smart?
Amy Chu, who's going to be here next on the 15th, not only wrote World on Fire and what she's going to talk about here, but famously wrote Tiger Moms, which is a really interesting book about the role of parents in the education of their children, and particularly how the Asians have just dominated the school systems to the extent that my old alma mater was sued for discriminating against Chinese by capping the number of Chinese that could come in.
Was that Harvard? They did.
Yeah. When we were at our daughter's graduation, about every second name was Chinese. And you sort of wonder, I'm in awe. It's just as simple as that. I just think it's incredible, but it's really parental involvement more than any other thing. They're not constitutionally different. It's the old, are their brain masses greater than those of other people on the planet? No, but their parents are a lot more involved.
Just that one comment on the same point. I have a friend who has a PhD in computer science, and she's Chinese, and she is still being demonized by people in her neighborhood with a PhD
much of this demonization of Asians comes from COVID. Really, the Harvard lawsuit against Chinese was pre-COVID by 2 years it originated. It was really just a disproportionate number of students. But where did it come from? I mean, where does any discrimination come from? It's our base instincts.
World War II, where we locked up all the...
Certainly, Japan didn't win any friends. Martha first.
Hold on, Martha.
They were brought here to work on railroads. And in Washington State, they were not allowed to own property until, I'm not positive of the year, but it was 1950s, something like that.
And Martha, you were a city council member in Spokane, so you know of what you speak.
Well, not always.
You know, we could go, we haven't done enough on racial inequality in our discussions here. It's one of those issues that's just so hard to get our heads around. It's hard because probably every one of us is, and I'll say I am guilty in my own way in so many different respects of ignoring the issue, pushing it aside, trying to say it just couldn't be. And I invite all of the black and Chinese people in the rooms to stand up and tell me I'm wrong.
Right. Excuse me.
Thank you.
Can I just say something? We have a very dear friend, a young couple who adopted 3 daughters from China. And these are beautiful, smart, intelligent, unbelievably sensitive, talented young women who are graduates now at Ponte Vedra High School and at the University of Florida. And they did very well in this community. You know, basically we're kind of nice people here, regardless of prejudice and conflicts in the world. We're kind of raised right and have good manners and so forth. So these girls had no problems until COVID. And when it was referred to as the China virus, you know, bitterly, it came from China. This has really caused, again, it's created fear, which would be natural. I mean, honestly, if somebody said tomorrow the Alabama virus is going to get us, I'd be scared to death of Alabama. This happened to be China, and these young women are suffering from that. When you know someone that well, who it's suddenly hitting, it really is a painful, painful thought. And to respond to what Martha said, I think if you started out in this country in any kind of enslavement, there's very little hope, or we're not going to see people being treated particularly equally as time goes on. The Japanese, the Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on, right? Or anyone who's attacked us, the terrorists, the Muslims. I mean, you know, everybody's got their prejudice. And all of it stems from fear.
These are all important topics for Parvez next weekend. I grew up in southern Idaho where there were Japanese internment camps. People were brought in from California, Japanese. And what's fascinating is to see the extraordinary level to which the formerly interred Japanese from Bingham County, Idaho, have moved into positions of leadership. They became top of their classes in the high schools. They're now in the city government and the county government. And this was 20 years ago, or 20 years ago, 50 years ago when I left Idaho. Last week when I graduated high school. How time flies. But it's just amazing. And again, I go back to what are the qualities that make some people just really excel. And I don't want to believe that there's anything racial about equality of excellence. Thank you all. Oh, by the way, if anybody has suggestions for what to put in the survey, you get an email from me, and just respond to that with ideas, okay? Thank you again.
Well done, well done.
Thank you for that round of applause. Both of you.
You're right.